Number 10. Brain infection. As it turns out, swimming in Florida is not always the best idea. A young innocent boy only 13 years old recently died after contracting a rare brain-eating amoeba after swimming in a Florida lake. The teen got the terrifying infection during a family vacation. The family was staying at a campground connected to a water park and lake. Everyone went swimming in the lake. It seemed perfectly fine. But just a few days later, the young boy named Tanner Wall began developing some very strange symptoms. These symptoms included nausea, vomiting, and headaches. His parents originally thought that he had strep throat, but when he began getting very sick, they took him to the hospital, where he was placed on a ventilator, and the doctors discovered a rare brain infection. According to Live Science, the kid contracted a parasitic amoeba of which there is no cure. This thing is a single-celled organism found in freshwater lakes and rivers. It's actually not even that uncommon, and is something that can be contracted in the southern states during the summer months. It probably happened because the boy swallowed water contaminated with the parasites, which then entered his brain and began to eat away at his brain tissue. Unfortunately, it did prove fatal, and the young boy died. Number 9. Snakes in the waterfall. A Brazilian doctor was swimming at the bottom of a waterfall when she made a rather terrifying discovery. Diney Salgo was just standing beneath the falls at a popular Brazilian tourist destination when, from out of nowhere, a venomous snake fell down the waterfall and landed right on top of her. It was a freak accident, and a 1 in a million chance. And yes, it totally ruined her swimming adventure. She screamed in pain, then desperately swam away from the waterfall as the venom from the snake pulsed through her veins. It managed to bite her twice on the arm, despite its awkward journey down the falls. The snake was identified as the highly dangerous Bothrops jararaca. This thing has such potent venom that it can very easily kill a person in just a handful of minutes. The venom causes swelling at the site of the bite, followed by necrosis, blistering, and then some very uncomfortable bleeding from the skin, gums, and even nose. Often these symptoms can lead to death by shock and renal failure. It's lucky for Diney that she made it to the hospital so quickly, as she was given an antidote to the snake venom and put in emergency surgery. By the time she reached the hospital, 70% of her airways had already been compromised. But thankfully, Newsweek reported that she was put in the ICU in stable condition and was expected to make a full recovery. We kinda wonder why this snake decided to take a dive off the waterfall in the first place. Maybe the serpent was just feeling a little adventurous that day. Number 8. Iron Man gone wrong. The Ironman 70.3 Calgary Triathlon is an extremely dramatic race to see who's the best. The triathlon involves swimming, cycling, and running. But this Canadian sporting event turned into a tragedy when a competitor from Ontario drowned during the swimming portion of the race. He was 47 years old when he entered the competition. At around 8 o'clock in the morning, the local police were alerted that a man had drowned. It turned out he wasn't quite ready to be the ultimate Canadian Ironman. But how does a person participating in a triathlon drown? The swimming course was about 1.2 miles. Sometime during that swim, the unidentified victim was seen struggling and in great distress. It seemed that he had suffered some kind of heart failure while he was in the water. Volunteers quickly rushed into the water to pull him out, but by the time the emergency services personnel were ready to take him to the hospital, he had sadly already died. One of the eyewitnesses, whose husband was also participating in the race, said that sometimes these things just happen. Since the athletes push their bodies so hard, it's sad, but sometimes their bodies just stop. Do you know anyone who has completed a triathlon or marathon like this? What happened to them? Let us know in the comments down below. And if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe buttons if you haven't already. Number 7. Tragedy in China. An unbelievable tragedy was recently caught on video in China. It happened at a children's swimming pool in Jiyang City. A 4-year-old girl was in the swimming pool, while the 2 adults that were supposed to be watching her were standing with their backs to the pool, seemingly munching on some noodles out of a styrofoam box. The child was swimming okay for a little while, but then she flipped over with her head under the water so the adults couldn't hear her screaming. She then flailed and flailed, and the adults just kept eating their noodles, and by the time they turned around, the child was already dead. But the incident gets even worse. One of the women even placed another child in the small swimming pool and didn't even realize that there was a dead baby floating just a few inches away. It looks as if the child that was just put in the pool notices that something is amiss, but fails to raise any attention to the adults. It was later confirmed that the child left upside down had died. They seriously didn't figure out the girl was deceased for a shocking amount of time. The local police confirmed after that the child did indeed die in the swimming pool, though the women who were supposed to be watching the girl and were instead eating noodles have not been identified, nor has it been revealed whether they will be facing criminal charges. Number 6. Shark attack. In 2019, Paige Winter was just 17 years old when she got a new boyfriend. She had tickets to the Ariana Grande concert, and life couldn't have been any sweeter for the teenager. But then, she went to the beach with her family in North Carolina. She went swimming in the mid-afternoon. Being eaten by a shark was the last thing on her mind, and yet that's exactly what happened. Paige was innocently swimming in the shallow water at the time of the attack. She was with her sister, joking around and pretending to be a mermaid. But in the middle of her mermaid impersonation, she felt something grab her foot. She thought it was her dad playing a prank, but then whatever had a hold of her foot began to pull painfully hard. It was at that moment she knew something was wrong. Paige realized pretty quickly that she was being attacked by a shark. But instead of poking the shark in the eyes like she should have, she reached out her hand into its mouth and felt her skin rip apart. Thankfully, her dad came to the rescue and punched the shark in the face. He then carried her all the way back to the beach, where she had one less leg than when she went into the water. Paige recalls having the Ariana Grande song Breathing in her head as she laid in the sand. She said she knew she needed to keep breathing. She remembers being put on a boogie board and carried into the back of a pickup truck to a waiting helicopter. It took about 35 minutes in total. She remembers one of the doctors telling her that they were going to have to take her leg. She asked if she could have a really cool prosthetic and the doctor said yes, so Paige told her, "Let's do it." That's a pretty good attitude to have right after your leg was just ripped off by a shark. She has now made a full recovery, minus the leg. But she sounds cool. Number 5. Forced to swim. A woman has been sentenced to 4 years in jail after killing her husband by forcing him to exercise. The charge was reckless homicide. The crime was that the woman, her real name Chris Mason, was 41 years old and forced her 73-year-old husband James, who by the way had heart problems, to do laps around a pool. She didn't really mean to kill him, but she decided that he needed more exercise and that he should be swimming in their pool more often. After making him swim way beyond what he was capable of, he collapsed in her arms inside the indoor pool at the apartment complex where they were residing. She quickly brought him to the hospital, but he died the next day from complications. She literally made him swim himself to death. Do you think it's lawful that Chris Mason spends 4 years in prison? I mean, she was trying to save his life by making him exercise, not kill him. What do you think? Let us know in the comments down below. Number 4. Break in and swim. A woman in Florida was recently arrested after she broke into somebody's yard, got naked, and then swam around in his pool. According to the arrest report, it happened in Charlotte County, with the homeowner describing coming home from his doctor's appointment and seeing a pile of clothes beside the pool. He then realized there was a naked woman splashing around in the water. She was later identified as Heather Kennedy, who for some bizarre reason remained inside the pool even after the guy got home. By the time the officers arrived, she was still swimming. The audacity of this woman is legendary. She refused to get out of the pool and tried to resist the police officers who were left with no choice but to handcuff the woman and bring her to jail. She was ultimately charged with trespassing and resisting an officer, and she never did give her motive behind the break-in. But who knows? Maybe she just needed to cool down. Jail is a little harsh for something like this, don't you think? Number 3. Swimming with CROCS. A teenager from California is lucky to be alive after she was attacked by a vicious crocodile while on vacation in Mexico. She was staying at a Mexican resort at the Marriott in Puerto Vallarta when she and her friend went down to the beach for a midnight dip. It was shortly after they got into the water that a massive crocodile, about 12 feet long, came out of the darkness and clamped its super sharp teeth right onto her right leg and then dragged her screaming underneath the water. Luckily, her friend and 4 nearby locals helped to fight the giant reptile off. A hotel employee even showed up with a chunk of wood and began beating the crocodile until it let her go. The teenage girl was brought to safety, though she was in pretty rough shape. Her leg was torn up but not completely chewed off. She suffered muscle and tendon damage but will keep her leg and even her toes. She didn't even suffer any broken bones. However, if it hadn't been for the people who came to her rescue, she most likely would have been eaten. Number 2. Shot in the pool. In Atlanta, a brawl at a public pool led to a 17-year-old boy being shot and killed. The last thing anyone expects to happen to them at the public pool is to be shot to death. Swimming in stagnant pee left behind by dozens of people, absolutely. Shot in the face? Not so much. According to the Atlanta police, the victim was involved in an argument that escalated into a gunfight while everyone else was trying to swim in the pool. The shooter gunned the kid down in full view of everyone. I mean, who brings a gun to a public pool anyway? Amazingly, the city actually shut down all 12 of their outdoor public pools after the incident, saying the pools needed operational assessment. In other words, it's actually just too dangerous in Atlanta to be swimming in public. Number 1. A swarm of otters. A woman put on her wetsuit, her gloves, and her booties, and she entered the water at the Big Lagoon County Park at just about 8 o'clock in the morning. It was a little earlier than her usual swim time. She managed to get about 80 yards away from the boat ramp when she noticed that she wasn't alone. There was a group of otters swimming with her, which seemed kind of cute, until they swarmed her and began trying to rip her limbs off. According to what the woman told local news, she was just minding her own business when all of a sudden one of the otters grabbed hold of her. Then came more, and then more. She screamed, but they didn't let go. The otters began to bite and bite, as if they wanted to eat her for breakfast. Last time we checked, otters don't typically eat humans. An eyewitness saw at least 4 otters trying to kill this woman, and luckily several spectators ran into the water to scare off these vicious animals. And this poor woman swam back to shore covered in bite marks. She'd been bitten about 30 times and needed to undergo a series of rabies shots, as well as intravenous antibiotics. It turns out there is an otter den somewhere in the area, and if you swim in the lagoon too early in the morning, well yeah, they'll come and attack you. All we can say is, damn.
Chess Killer. Alexander Pakushkin is also known as the Chessboard Killer. He was busted back in 2007 and charged with killing an astonishing number of people, 48 to be exact. He got his nickname after the police found a chessboard covered in dates, with each date indicating a killing. This guy was marking down his foul deeds on a chessboard and had all except for 2 squares filled. Alexander was such a frightening villain to the Russian public when he was caught that they actually thought about bringing back the death penalty. Here's where things get even sicker. Alexander was having a personal competition with another serial killer from Russia named Andrei Sakatilo, who was convicted in 1992 of 52 murders. It was around the time of Andrei's trial that Alexander started killing. Who did Alexander kill? He mostly targeted old people by luring them into the park to have a drink at his deceased dog's grave. But there was no grave, only death for the victim. Alexander would typically beat them to death with a blunt instrument, something like a hammer or a rusty pipe, and then he threw their bodies into the sewer. The police reported that some of them were even still alive as they drowned in the disgusting sewage. As time went on, Alexander got sloppy. He stopped disposing of the bodies, leaving them to be discovered by the public. It wasn't until 2003 that residents of Moscow realized there was a serial killer on the loose. It took another 3 years for the authorities to capture Alexander. They only got him because he got careless and became so blindly murderous that he killed one of his co-workers at the supermarket where he worked. 9. Moonlight Murders. The Texarkana Moonlight Murders were the inspiration behind the horror classic The Town That Dreaded Sundown. The murders were committed in Texarkana during the spring of 1946 by an unidentified lunatic who is still unknown to this day. The media calls him the Phantom Slayer, and he's credited with 10 weeks of brutal mayhem, attacking 8 people and killing 5. This was between February 22nd and May 3rd of 1946. His first 2 victims survived the attack, but from then on, the killer went on slaying a victim every 3 weeks. The Texas Rangers investigated the case but made no headway. Texarkana went into a state of panic. Businesses closed up. There were police patrolling the streets and neighborhoods, but the killer vanished into the dark. After 3 months without a murder, the Texas Rangers left town. The only potential suspect was a guy named Yoel Sweeney, a petty criminal who may have been suddenly consumed by murderous rage. However, there was never enough evidence to indict the man, and if it was him, he never killed again. 8. Casey Anthony. Cindy Anthony called the police in Orlando, Florida on July 15, 2008. She reported that her granddaughter Kaylee had been missing for 31 days. She was alarmed because her daughter Casey, Kaylee's mom, told the authorities that Kaylee was with a babysitter named Zenaida Gonzalez, a story that turned out not to be true. When the police got suspicious and took Casey to Universal Studios where she said she worked, it turned out that that was a lie too. She didn't have a job at Universal Studios. Over the following months, the country was gripped by fear of what happened to young Caylee Anthony. Meanwhile, the police were searching for clues. They couldn't seem to find the little girl, but they did put together heaps of evidence against her mother. Finally, in October, they indicted Casey Anthony on 7 criminal counts, one of them being first-degree murder. The young girl was reported missing in July, and her decomposed remains were discovered in December. They were found in a secluded forest near the Anthony home. 2 years after that, the trial was held for Casey. The prosecution put forward that Casey had chloroformed her daughter and then suffocated her to death by wrapping duct tape around her mouth and nose. Casey claims the kid drowned by accident in the family pool. She said that she was distraught about what happened, feared getting into trouble, and so she covered it up. But the whole thing, according to Casey, had just been an accident. To this day, nobody except Casey knows what really happened. According to CNN, she ended up being acquitted of the serious charges and is now living a quiet life in Florida. Do you believe her story? What do you think really happened, and what do you think the consequences should be? Let us know in the comments below, and if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe buttons if you haven't already. 7. The Zodiac Killer. The most important thing you need to know about the Zodiac Killer is that he was never caught. He did, however, take credit for a string of murders that went down in the San Francisco Bay Area in the 1960s. It was the killer who gave himself the nickname we all know him by today. He has been directly linked to no less than 5 murders that took place between 1968 and 1969. According to his official biography, he may have killed even more. He was one of the most brazen criminals in history for taunting the police and sending threatening letters to the local newspapers all the way up until 1974. After that, he vanished completely, never committed any more public crimes, and seemed retired from the spotlight. His bizarre correspondence with the media started on August 1, 1969. He sent handwritten letters to the San Francisco Examiner, the San Francisco Chronicle, and other newspapers. In the letters, he stated that he killed 2 teenagers the previous Christmas at Lake Herman. The letters contained details of the murders that only the killer could have possibly known. In a bizarre move, he promised to kill more people if the letters weren't printed on the front page of each newspaper. To make matters even more mysterious, the letters contained ciphers that, if solved, were promised to allow the FBI to track this guy down and catch him. A local high school teacher named Donald Hardin cracked the code. But the Zodiac Killer had lied. The letters contained nothing that could help police catch him. He went on taunting San Francisco until he, presumably, got bored and just stopped. 6. The West Memphis Murders. Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miscali Jr. are known as the West Memphis Three. They were just teenagers in 1994 when they were convicted of a triple murder in West Memphis. They were caught killing 3 other teenagers, Michael Moore, Chris Byers, and Stevie Branch. This wouldn't have been such national news if not for what came out at their trial, when the 3 teens admitted to killing the other 3 teens as part of a cult ritual. When the 3 bodies were discovered in 1993 in a ditch deep in the woods, about 24 hours after being reported missing, they were found beaten, naked, and tied up like hogs. One of them had even been castrated. There wasn't much evidence for police to go on, other than the immediate assumption that it had something to do with a satanic ritual. It caused an outbreak of fear, with the locals worried that a group of Satanists had moved into the area. The big break in the case came because of Jerry Driver, Damian Eccles' probation officer. He had dealt with a teenager enough to believe he was involved with an evil sect. After Jerry shared his suspicions with the police working on the case, they were quick to track down Eccles and his 2 accomplices. Miss Kelly quickly broke under interrogation and confessed. It turned out there was no cult, just 3 seriously misguided youths. 5. The Boston Strangler. It took 49 years for police to solve the case of the Boston Strangler. It all started in the 1960s when women across the Massachusetts area became the target of a brutal serial killer. By the time the reign of terror had come to a close, the Boston Strangler had murdered 11 women. 5 different district attorneys' offices were baffled by the string of murders and came up empty when it came to solving them. In fact, the police would never have even solved this crime if it hadn't been for the murderer, a convicted felon named Albert DeSalvo, admitting while in jail that it was he who killed the 11 women. But despite getting a confession from the killer, the case really didn't come to a close. Albert was found dead in his cell a short time later under dubious circumstances. This was in 1973. 40 years later, in July of 2013, the Boston Police Department finally got DNA evidence that directly links Albert to the crimes, specifically to the murder of Mary Sullivan. DNA found on the scene was an almost perfect match to the DNA taken from Albert's nephew. The acquiring of the DNA proved to be a clever trick on behalf of the police. Someone followed the nephew to his place of work and then took a water bottle with DeSalvo's DNA on it. This gave them cause to dig up Albert's body after 30 years underground and confirm the DNA sample beyond a doubt. 4. Joshua Ward. It doesn't get any more true crime than the recent case of Joshua Ward. The Ohio man has been charged in 2 counts of capital murder. Joshua had been dating Kelly Kramer, a woman 17 years younger than himself. According to the official statements, Joshua only dated Kelly for 6 months in 2016 and 2017. When the relationship came to an abrupt end, Joshua believed Kelly had destroyed him, so he wanted a way to get back at her. The best way to do this seemed to be by going after her young son, who was only in 4th grade at the time. According to the boy's grandfather, he was a straight-A student before Joshua got involved. In the court proceedings, it came to light that Joshua had likely acted out of jealousy, but it also came to light that Kelly Kramer had a long history of drugs and prostitution. She was also a member of an underground BDSM network, which is how she met Joshua in the first place. Joshua Ward told the police that after he broke up with Kelly, she went back to prostituting, which upset him a great deal. But no matter which way you slice it, and no matter how messed up both of them were, Joshua walked into a house in Kentucky where Kelly was living with her son and shot them both in the face. We're still waiting for the conviction in this case, but it looks like Joshua will be getting at least 20 years behind bars. 3. The boy in the box. The dead boy that was found in a box 61 years ago is popularly known as America's unknown child. The boy was found in the Fox Chase neighborhood of Philadelphia in 1957. His remains were uncovered in a box stashed on the side of the road. Police said he was between 4 and 6 at the time of death and discovered badly beaten and fully naked. It was obviously a murder, and police suspected a psychopath because it looked as though the child's hair had been cut after he was killed. There were also signs of malnourishment, suggesting he had been kept captive. To this day, the boy in the box is the longest-lasting cold case file in Philadelphia. The strangest part of it all is that nobody has ever identified the kid. Over 400,000 flyers were put out showing the child's face. Over 270 police academy recruits have looked at the crime scene, and there was even a white handkerchief discovered with the letter G on it. Still, there has never been any breaks in the case, and his identity is still unknown. 2. Icebox murders. The Icebox murders are a series of killings that happened in Houston and are still unsolved. The case started on June 23, 1965, when police were requested to do a welfare check on Fred and Edwina Rogers. Police knocked on the door. Nobody answered, so they kicked it in. Inside the trailer, they found the refrigerator filled with stacks of meat, but this wasn't any ordinary meat. It was human meat, taken from dismembered bodies, then wrapped in plastic for safekeeping. There are also a pair of human heads in the crisper. But Fred and Edwina had nothing to do with the murders. They were the ones who had gotten murdered. Edwina had a bullet wound to her head, and Frank had been bludgeoned to death with a hammer. They had both been drained of their blood and cut up into slices of meat. The medical examiner investigating the crime told the Globe's Time that whoever did this had known what they were doing and had taken their sweet time. The police first thought the killer was their son, a man named Charles Rogers. He was known as a recluse who lived in his bedroom with his parents and only ever spoke to them by slipping notes underneath his door. It very well could have been Charles, but the police never managed to find him even after conducting a nationwide manhunt. He vanished without a trace and was declared legally dead a decade later in 1975. 1. The Werewolf Killer. The werewolf killer slaughtered women indiscriminately for 20 years. His real name is Mikhail Popkov. He's a Siberian ex-police officer who murdered right under the noses of fellow police officials. For 2 long decades, he targeted women and then stabbed them to death. This is despite being both a husband and father. You see, the werewolf killer was a complete psycho, living a double life without his family knowing. His co-workers and the people he was close to described him as the model husband and the perfect father. He was also described as charming, funny, and always the life of the party. But in 1992, he started killing. The werewolf only killed women. He would roam around to different bars and ask drunk women if they needed a ride home. Once he got them in the car, it was game over. He took them out to the woods, did really horrible things to them, butchered them like animals, and then went back to his family as if nothing happened. His victims were between the ages of 16 and 40, and he almost always stabbed them to the point where they looked like they had been torn open by a werewolf. This is where he got the name from. Mikhail was finally captured when one of his victims escaped. Well, she didn't escape so much as he forgot to murder her. He beat her head against a tree and left her for dead, but she was still alive. She quickly identified Mikhail as the murderer, and his DNA directly connected him to the crime scene. He was arrested just a few years ago in 2012 and found guilty of 22 murders. Since his conviction, he's admitted to killing 60 more.
Number 10. Gator Danger. A man in Jamaica had to spend a night inside of a refrigerator. It was one of the worst nights of his life. He was wounded and terrified after he became the victim of a vicious reptile attack. He was a professional electrician named Nigel Gale. At 48 years old, he decided to hit the beach after work to wind down. This was in the town of Poor Man's Corner, and it proved to be a monumental mistake. The name of the town alone already sounds bad. The second he entered the water, a crocodile came out of nowhere and chomped down on Nigel's leg. He screamed for help, but there was nobody to save him. Poor Nigel had to defend himself from the hungry lizard, fighting the reptile off and by some miracle getting himself free. But he was in such rough shape as he limped away from the crocodile that he knew he wouldn't get far. So, seeing an old and abandoned refrigerator on the beach, Nigel quickly used his belt as a makeshift tourniquet to stop the bleeding, climbed into the refrigerator, and he spent the entire night in there hiding from the crocodile. The worst part of this whole thing is that the crocodile knew he was hiding in the refrigerator. As Nigel cowered inside the small metal box all night, the crocodile continued to approach and sniff at him. He had to make loud noises to keep it from opening the fridge with its nose. Then, after 12 hours, people finally showed up at the beach and rescued him. Nigel had to get his leg amputated at the hospital, but at least he wasn't completely consumed by the hungry animal. Number 9. Yellowstone National Park. When you think about places to go swimming, Yellowstone Park probably isn't high up on the list. And rightly so, because swimming at Yellowstone Park can be deadly. Just ask the poor guy who was literally dissolved after falling into a boiling pool of acid. His name was Colin Scott, and he kind of died on purpose. He tried to go for a relaxing soak in one of the thermal pools at Yellowstone Park. This is entirely illegal, and for good reason. The victim's sister even recorded the incident on her mobile phone, with the two laughing it up, thinking it was all fun and games. Well, the fun and games ended when Colin Scott literally dissolved like in an episode of Breaking Bad. He didn't jump into the pool all at once. Instead, Colin dipped his toes into the extremely hot acid, and before he realized just how hot it was, he slipped and his whole body fell in. Of course, this isn't actually a pool of acid. It's simply a geothermal feature filled with water that has an extremely high acidity content. The acidity content is so high that by the time the rescue workers arrived to try and scoop out Colin's remains, he had already dissolved into a puddle of goo. Number 8. River pirates. Pirates don't just exist in Disney movies. A California couple named Adam and Emily Hartow, along with their 2 young daughters ages 3 and 7, bumped into a few pirates while boating in the Amazon River. As it turns out, the Amazon River is not the best place to go swimming, never mind sailing. The pirates boarded their vessel uninvited and forced them to drive to the nearby river city of Puerto dos Dias. According to the local police, the family was then held hostage. They were stripped of all their belongings, and the pirates hightailed it out of there. But when the authorities arrived, the family was nowhere to be found. Sometime between being robbed and their pirates fleeing, the family had managed to escape the boat and run into the jungle. They most likely jumped overboard and ran off for dear life. Luckily, the authorities did eventually find the family hiding in the Amazon jungle. They were in pretty rough shape, covered in insect bites and half-starved, but they were alive. After the family had set off in 2012 to travel to Patagonia in their van from California, they ended up staying in South America. They fell in love with Brazil and embraced jungle life. However, if the family will continue to live in Brazil after being attacked by pirates on the river remains to be seen. Quite likely they'll pack up and head back home. If that happened to you, would you risk coming back? Let us know in the comments below, and if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe buttons if you haven't already. Number 7. Bubbly Creek. Bubbly Creek in Chicago is not a place you should swim. In fact, it's not a place you should go anywhere near. The creek was once part of a wetland, but is now the polluted result of the meatpacking business in the Union stockyards. Meatpacking plants have been dumping their putrid waste into the creek for decades. They've literally been filling the creek with blood, chemical waste, and the entrails of dead animals. Ugh. These processing facilities dumped so much animal waste into the creek that it started to bubble because of the decomposition. It became a literally bubbling pool of methane and hydrogen sulfide gas. It got so bad that a sludge rose to the surface that was so thick in some parts that people could walk across it as if strolling across ice. And to make things even more disgusting, entrepreneurs used to go down there at night and cut out blocks of this sludge, rendering it into a type of lard they would sell to customers. Luckily, it's 2021 and there are now programs in effect to clean the creek. Conservation people are working hard to reduce the stench of death still wafting out of the water and to bring some semblance of nature back into the picture. But it's still one of the worst waterways in the world and not somewhere you should be skinny dipping. Number 6. The Merced River. The Merced River in California was recently closed to the public because of toxic algae responsible for some tragic deaths. The deaths go back to August, when a couple were found dead with their dog and their 1-year-old child. After their bodies were discovered, the Bureau of Land Management shut the river, the nearby campgrounds, and even the recreation area down. The decision was made after testing the water downstream from where the family was found dead and discovering something sinister. The river was undergoing an algae bloom, which is basically what happens when rivers become shallow and warm. Algae is produced, and in this case, it was toxic. The family probably went swimming, thinking it was just an ordinary river, and then unknowingly ingested the toxins. This could have caused respiratory paralysis. It may also have caused a neurotoxicity, killing the unfortunate family within just minutes of being exposed. Number 5. The CITARUM River. The CITARUM River in Indonesia is considered to be one of the most dangerous places to swim in the world. This is because it's the most polluted river on the planet. For the last 5 years, the local fishermen haven't even been able to make a living because all the fish are dead. Instead of catching fish, the people here catch glass bottles, dirty old boots, and pieces of trash. Every single day, somewhere around 20,000 tons of waste and 34,000 tons of sewage water from over 2,000 factories are dumped into the river. And this place used to be clean and pristine. Now the fish are gone, the river is so thick with garbage that you could probably walk across its surface, and in most places, you can't even see the water. Plus, there are dead animals floating in it. Yeah, gross. A swim in this river would almost certainly give you some kind of disease. Yet the CITARUM River is a water source for 25 million people who live in the area. The river supplies them with cooking water, electricity, and they use it for agriculture. It's also responsible for filling the largest reservoir in Indonesia. Not only do the local people swim in this river, they drink from it. And in 2013, the Blacksmith Institute did a study that found the levels of lead inside the river are up to 1,000 times worse than the US standard for drinking water. It's not only lead either, it's also aluminum, iron, and manganese. The local people are now beginning to show what happens when your main water source is polluted. A scary number of people are beginning to come down with skin diseases like scabies and infections. They also have respiratory distress from inhaling the nearby smoke from the factories, and all their crops are suffering because they basically get watered with sewage. Number 4. Shark attack. If you've ever thought about swimming at Gray Whale Cove State Beach in California, you may want to reconsider. A man from California named Nemanja Spasojevic was looking for crabs when he found a giant great white shark instead. He definitely didn't wake up that morning thinking he would be eaten by a great white shark. Yet, in the middle of his swim, he felt a sudden pain and a slight pressure at his legs. When he looked down, he was staring into the beady black eyes of a great white shark with his leg in its massive jaws. Nemanja got extremely lucky this time. The shark let go all on its own and allowed him to kick away with his one good leg as hard as he could toward the rocky shore. But even though he only got bit once, he was in rough shape. The second he burst out of the water, he began screaming for help. A local man fishing on the shore came to his rescue just in time as Nemanja collapsed. He was losing a phenomenal amount of blood. His wetsuit was literally filled with red blood leaking from the puncture wounds left in his leg from the shark's teeth. Medics quickly showed up on the beach and took Nemanja to the hospital, where they fixed him up. And he got to keep his leg, which was lucky because a lot of the time these attacks end in needing a limb amputated. According to NBC News, he now has a slight limp, but other than that is completely fine. He's also quite aware of just how lucky this encounter was, as it could have been significantly worse. Number 3. The Boiling Lake. There's a boiling lake on the island of Dominica. It's about 7 miles, 11 kilometers from the capital city of Roseau. And even though it's a popular tourist destination, it's not somewhere you need to bring a bathing suit. The lake is filled with a cloud of vapor at all times, proof of just how hot the water beneath it is. It's actually the second largest hot lake in the world, around 250 feet, 76 meters across. The only boiling lake larger than this one is called Frying Pan Lake in New Zealand. The water here can be up to almost 200 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's only at the edges of the lake. In the center, it gets even hotter. The reason the lake is so hot is because the water is resting inside an empty volcano. But there's still molten magma beneath, working kind of like an oven to keep the water above continuously boiled. Obviously, this is a dangerous place to swim, but it's also a dangerous place just to visit. 3 hikers along with their Dominican guide perished while hiking around the lake because the magma chamber beneath released a sudden burst of volcanic gases that caused them to asphyxiate. As they choked, they fell over the edge and plummeted to their deaths. Number 2. Crocodile Waters. An Australian teenager made an extremely unfortunate decision when he jumped into a river infested with crocodiles and was nearly killed. To make the decision even more ridiculous, CBS News reported that the teenager jumped into the river on a dare. He was only 18 years old from the state of Queensland. It was about 2:30 in the morning and the teenager was bragging in the hostel dormitory where he was staying that he could easily swim across the river regardless of the aggressive saltwater crocodiles. Naturally, the others in the hostel dared him to do it. But nobody actually believed he would jump into the water. The whole situation just kinda got out of hand. The group left the hostel, walked down to the river, and within seconds the teen had worked up the courage to do what he said he would. Unfortunately, the crocodiles were waiting. It took him less than a second for a crocodile to bite onto him. Blood gushed forth in the water, the crocodiles were snapping their jaws, and it was lucky that the teenager managed to scramble out of the river before he drowned. He was left embarrassed with serious injuries to one of his arms. But in the end, he did complete the dare and live to tell the tale. But yeah, you probably don't want to swim anywhere near where you know there are crocodiles, even if someone double dog dares you. Number 1. Rwanda's Exploding Lake. There's an exploding lake in Rwanda. It's probably the last place on Earth you'd want to go for a swim. It's called Lake Kivu, and it's one of only 3 exploding lakes in the world. It hasn't exploded just yet, but it could go off at any moment. The issue is a massive amount of carbon dioxide and methane underneath the lake. It's so volatile that the combination of gases could cause an explosion at any second, which would result in the immediate suffocation of everyone living within the surrounding areas. But this lake has proved to be an invaluable source of energy for the country of Rwanda. They believe they can use the lake to create massive amounts of electricity to power the entire country. They're currently trying to remove the horrible gases from the lake to make it less dangerous, but because the area is so volcanically active, it could explode without warning at any time. The explosion would be the result of carbon dioxide and methane exploding to release a sudden burst of CO2. And to give you an idea of just how dangerous this can be, a similar lake in the nearby country of Cameroon with the same properties exploded and killed 1,800 people. Lake Kivu in Rwanda is 2,000 times larger. An explosion could result in 2,000 times more casualties. Thanks for watching. What's the craziest swimming spot you've ever been to? Tell us about it in the comments down below, and be sure to hit subscribe and come back again for more amazing videos from the channel.